Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. Johannesburg is where most of my research and stuff has been based. It's my favorite city in the world, and it is thrilling to see so much interest in humor. When I started doing this 9 years ago with my doctoral research, there were just a few journal articles out there. And since then, there have been at least two major conferences, one at STIAS at Stellenbosch in 2019, the other at Nelson Mandela University in 2022, and now here at Wits. And so I am really, really thrilled to see interest in this topic grow. So I want to talk, I guess, a little bit about my background as somebody who comes from historical training and the methodological challenges that come from historical research into humor. I want to share maybe a story from this book that comes out of my dissertation that I'm working on about, again, South African humor in like the early to mid 20th century. And I also want to maybe say some things about where I see humor studies kind of going in South Africa and in Southern Africa moving forward. So yeah, I'll get right to it. I think one of the real strengths of humor studies is the way that interdisciplinarity is written into its basic DNA as a field. So if you look at the theorists of humor, you'll find performing artists, philosophers, psychologists, writers, and historians among them. Personally, my first exposure to academic humor studies came in a religious studies classroom at the College of William and Mary. I took a class under John Morell, who's a name that might be familiar. He's published a lot on humor studies. And he used to do a class at William and Mary called Comedy, Tragedy, and Religion, where he talked about different religious traditions and their approach to humor and laughter. And it's a class that, honestly, I think left me with more questions than answers. But it got some themes sort of bobbing around in my head that stuck with me. And so I would say that my first entry point into this, you can change the slide. The summer after I was in that class, I went on a school facilitated study abroad to northern Spain, to the Camino de Santiago, which is a great pilgrimage route in that part of Spain. And we were doing pilgrimage studies field research. And I was struck. So you go to Santiago de Compostela, which is the end of the pilgrimage route. You see this incredibly ornate, Baroque facade, medieval cathedral. It's an incredibly grave and sort of serious space. But you can change the slide. I was struck by kind of the incongruities and the ways that pilgrims, when they entered this space, deflated a lot of the seriousness of it. If you know about St. James, you know that he's not just an apostle, but also sort of the national patron saint of Spain. And so there's not just kind of the general sort of Christian aspect of the place that Santiago de Compostela is supposed to be his burial place, but also this idea that he's really, really associated with the Reconquista. There's imagery in the cathedral about Muslims being slaughtered in the course of the reinvasion of the Iberian Peninsula. And yet, when pilgrims enter this space, they do all kinds of strange things. One of the things that you're supposed to do, and I don't know if you can see it very well on the slide, there's a big statue of St. James, like bejeweled, festooned statue right behind the altar. And one of the things that pilgrims are supposed to do is embrace it from behind, almost sort of like spoon it when they get into the cathedral. And I thought, wow, that's really weird, especially because everybody else in the church can see you when you do that, because it's right behind the altar. You've also got this botafumeiro, this big incense burner, which swings from transept to transept. And you go there and it seems like this incredible sort of exotic spiritual thing. But really, the fact that that thing exists is because pilgrims are stinky, right? Pilgrims are even more stinky and filthy than ordinary medieval people. And so again, you have this idea of like this intensely ornate and serious space that's being invaded by the bodily and the earthly. And so when I think about people who choose to laugh in South African history, people who choose to do humor in South Africa, the metaphor I think is very, very similar, right? Think about the spatial legacy that apartheid left this country with. Think about the very building that we're standing in here. This is literally Lord Alfred Milner's house, a man who was responsible in part for the creation of the concentration camps during the Anglo-Boer War, a man who was responsible for setting the foundation of segregation-era South Africa in the years after that war, right? And so basically anywhere you go in this country, structurally, right, there's an atmosphere of gravity, there's an atmosphere of seriousness. And so it's all the more fascinating and subversive to me, as somebody who is not South African, to see how people interact with that space and that weight in a humorous way. And so, yeah. So we all know the whites' famous quip about explaining jokes, right? It's like dissecting a frog. The innards are discouraging to all but the purely scientific mind. I was thinking about, I don't know if anybody here has read The Great Cat Massacre, which is a famous essay about this incredibly gruesome and cruel event that happened in early 18th century France, killing and torturing cats, and how the people who did it found it absolutely hilarious at the time. So the historian Robert Darnton sort of tries deep historical context to break down how on earth it was that people found this to be funny when they were doing it. But in the South African context, I think of Leon Schuster. So change slide, please. I did a search for Leon Schuster clips before I got here, and I just sort of picked the first one that came up. This is a famous filmmaker, very, very lucrative chain of movies in the 90s and early 2000s. A lot of them are candid camera prank videos where he is in various levels of racial disguise. And the clip I found here is one where he is, you can see him, he's white and Afrikaans, but he is dressed as a black traffic cop, and he is stopping people on the highway in the Northwest province and pretending to cut their driver's licenses up with scissors. And so it really heightens all kinds of stereotypes. On the one hand, you have stereotypes about sort of the incompetent black post-apartheid police force. On the other hand, all the people who get stopped in the clip are kind of very, very stereotypical kind of Northwest province Boer types, right? And so he's heightening that contrast, right? And I think, honestly, if I was going to sort of interpret this using my own critical mind, I would focus a lot on these ideas of sort of racial disguise and stereotyping and all the sort of historical burdens that those are tied into. But I was fascinated with the way that people were interacting with this clip in the comments, and you can change the slide, because it shows sort of how small my own perspective is as somebody, right? One of the things that I find, and you know, I don't know if you can read all of these through the screen, a lot of people, you know, are focusing on different things than the racial masquerade at play there. A lot of people are focusing, I think you can change the slide. Yeah, a lot of the people are focusing on the fact that Leon Schuster goes up to these guys and says, "Hey, Boer," to them, to greet them. And there's almost a sense in which people are sort of living vicariously to see what it would be like, right? They're not going to go up to somebody who looks like one of these farmers from Ventersdorp and greet them with "Hey, Boer." But Leon Schuster gets to do it. Then he gets punched in the face some of the time. And then he gets to take off the mask and say, "Well, actually, I'm white. So you've been shuxed," et cetera, et cetera. Other people are, you know, talking about sort of general nostalgia for South Africa. So if you go back to the last slide, Yeah, I mean, comments are very interesting, right? Like Leon Schuster is one of the greatest South Africans. He played a pivotal role in our Rainbow Nation, which seems like kind of a strange thing to comment on, you know, a sketch that at its core is about blackface and police misconduct and also the pretty overt racism of the people that he stops and confronts. It's a pretty bleak picture, but somehow people are taking away a kind of pride from that. So I want to also complicate this clip in terms of thinking a little bit more even about its own history. So this clip is from a movie called Oh Shucks, I'm Hotful, which was released in 2004, so 20 years ago. The clip was uploaded to YouTube in 2014, 10 years later, and the top 10 comments, all the things that you see up here, are from 2017 or later. And if you think about it, South Africa is a very different place today than it was in 2004 or even in 2017. If you remember the mini scandal that happened when a lot of Leon Schuster movies were taken off of Showmax, that wasn't actually until 2020, right? So people's attitudes towards comedy like this have, I think, even changed considerably, you know, in the course of time that this clip has been on the internet. Furthermore, because of economic inequality and the power of the algorithm, we definitely can't assume that the YouTube users who are interacting with this content are in any way a representative sample of South Africans as a whole. We could complicate this even further, and we could talk about sort of multiple audiences for this sketch, right? We can think about the people who watched Oh Shucks, I'm Hotful in theaters, sort of an audience in the most conventional sense. We could also talk about people who saw the movie later on VHS or DVD, and the dynamics there matter because people who are watching these things on VHS or DVD are probably in more homogenous settings. They're probably with family and friends versus out in public at a theater. And then finally, again, 10 plus years later, we have people interacting with this content as a clip on social media. And so a lot of those people are probably completely by themselves. They're not in a social gathering at all. And yet, unlike the previous two iterations of audience, they're able to interact with other viewers through comment section, right? And through social media. So there are simultaneously so many different potential meanings and so many gaping holes in our understanding when we start to think about pieces of media like this historically, even when it's just 20 years old, as in the case of this Leon Schuster clip. Nevertheless, I think it's valuable. So like I said, my first book project focuses on humor in the early to mid 20th century in South Africa. And my analysis ended up sort of focusing itself on three different themes or insights that I found really important. I became interested in thinking about lineages of humor. So not just the content of jokes, but about the interaction of particular humorists and historical figures and the methods they used to disseminate their art or their humor to the public. I found that intergenerational links emerged at key hinge points in my project, and that these connections sometimes crossed otherwise really, really formidable boundaries of race and class and language and culture. Notice I did not say gender, because we'll get to that. And given that I was getting more and more plugged into the contemporary South African stand-up scene at the time, I was also really struck at how persistent the challenges have been for humorists throughout South African history. A lot of the challenges that people were running up against in the teens and 20s were very, very similar to the kinds of structural challenges that people were coming up against in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s, which was a little bit bleak. So I find that humor, among other things, reveals terrains of historical censorship, right? The South African media landscape, the entertainment landscape, has always been a highly unequal and consolidated place, and consolidated in particular directions. And while the actual details of that have changed over the course of South African history, the sort of structural facts remain, I think, remarkably consistent. And I do think that humor does reveal something about the inner nature of community. Through deep historical analysis, I found that it was possible not only to draw lines back from someone like Trevor Noah to Leon Schuster, to a predecessor to Leon Schuster on the radio, Cecil Whiteman, to R.R.R. Dlomo and Stephen Black, who I'm going to talk about in a second, but that doing so could move us not to a specious understanding of South Africa's national essence. The Canadian humorist Stephen Laycock has a great metaphor for this. He talks about sort of national stereotypes of humor as, quote, a scarecrow on a clothesline flapping in the wind. But rather, this kind of historical analysis could lead us to a specific and generative understanding of humor's power to move people towards and away from certain dreams, certain loves, and certain hatreds. So, how much time do I have? I have about, all right, we're good. We're good. So I want to tell you a little story that, again, comes from this book project. It starts as sort of a story of cultural entrepreneurship, and I think it reveals the struggle that people throughout South African history have faced in terms of creating art at multiple levels. The entry point to my doctoral research was a playwright now named Stephen Black. You can change the slide now. Born in the 1880s in Cape Town, he was born into a lower middle class English-speaking family. He dropped out of school at age 12 and he moved to Kimberley, the Diamond City, where he became a prize fighter. After he turned 20, he moved back to Cape Town and he returned to his studies, training for a career in journalism and eventually getting a job at the Cape Argus, reporting on boxing and low-level court cases, so things like drunk and disorderly conduct cases. In 1907, his work was discovered by Rudyard Kipling, who used to spend his winters in Cape Town at a cottage which is still there called the Woolsack. And Kipling saw Stephen Black as a potential protege. Kipling was also, quote unquote, colonial born. And the story is that one day he burst into the offices of the Cape Argus and demanded to know the identity of this anonymous reporter who was putting a humorous spin on these court cases that he was writing about in the paper. So Stephen Black wrote a play based on Kipling's advice. And unfortunately, it was kind of the undoing for their relationship. The play that Stephen Black wrote was called Love in the Hyphen. It was a ruthless satire of some of Rudyard Kipling's best friends in Cape Town society. It was a play that accused Cape Town's Anglophile elites of being vain and shallow. It talked about their sort of simpering, embarrassing desire to marry British aristocrats and military officers and compared that explicitly to interracial marriage and sort of the urge to social climb across racial barriers. And Kipling cut him off. They never spoke again. And Stephen Black resented that for the rest of his life. It put a chip on his shoulder that never, ever disappeared. Now, Black was a friend of the Afrikaner nationalist cartoonist D.C. Boonzaier, and that's actually a portrait of Stephen Black that Boonzaier made of him. He was a mentor to Herman Charles Bosman towards the end of his life. In 1910, he wrote a play, and you can change the slide now. He wrote a play called Helena's Hope Limited, which was written to celebrate the act of union that created modern-day South Africa. And the character he wrote for himself in the play was Jeremiah Luke Mbene, whom he played personally himself in blackface. It's the first intellectual Black South African depicted on the white stage. And this is actually from a phase of the play before he's sort of become an intellectual. The plot of the play is really interesting. Jeremiah is arguably kind of the hero because he foils this plot by this mining magnate Jewish villain who is swindling a poor Boer family out of their farm. And I should say here that, you know, when we're talking about sort of the Janus face nature of humor, Stephen Black was quite sympathetic to Black and colored aspirations for participation in South Africa's intellectual scene, as we'll see, but he was pretty viciously anti-Semitic and pretty viciously anti-Indian as well. But Jeremiah was a character that stayed with him for the rest of his life. In 1929, he founded a newspaper called the Sjambok. And the Sjambok was one of the first sort of gutter tabloid newspapers in South African history. It was written for sort of a lower middle class white male audience. And one of the ways that Stephen Black, who had a massive chip on his shoulder because of his experience, among other things, with Rudyard Kipling, was he figured out that he could really stick it to the establishment figures in South African journalism that he loathed and resented by printing the work of Black intellectuals in his paper. So you can change the slide now. He was the first editor of a white newspaper in South Africa to hire Black writers on staff. R.R. Dlomo, the Black journalistic great, the brother of the ANC Youth League co-founder Herbert Dlomo, wrote short stories for the paper. The trade unionist H.D.T. Mzashe published investigative pieces, including some very innovative satires of South African life from an African perspective. He was one of the only newspapers in South Africa to review Sol Plaatje's book Umhudi when it came out. And he cultivated a small but considerable multiracial readership that's visible in the letters that Black intellectuals were writing to the paper and interacting with its commentary. He also published a column called The Telephone Conversations of Jeremiah. And I think, actually, wait just a second, where this character that he had come up with in 1910 would call his friend Joshua on the phone, and they would make jokes about the news. Stephen Black died in 1931, but Jeremiah actually outlived him by several decades. So R.R. Dlomo, this young short story writer that Stephen Black had hired at the Sjambok, and now you can change the slide, he resurrected Jeremiah and Joshua in the pages of a newspaper called the Bantu World, which in the 1930s was the largest circulating Black newspaper in South Africa. And R.R. Dlomo kept writing dialogues between Jeremiah and Joshua until well into the 1960s. So on the left, you see this is one of Stephen Black's telephone conversations of Jeremiah. And then on the right, we see in Bantu World another dialogue between Jeremiah and Joshua. Obviously, within the Black press, Jeremiah and Joshua took on whole new life, right? Whereas before, and you can kind of tell this by the nature of the illustrations there, the banter between the two was heavily directed towards a white audience, sort of lampooning the intellectual pretensions of Black people. In the Black press, Jeremiah and Joshua afforded readers an insider's view of township life. And also, and Corinne Sandwith has talked about this really well as well, it also modeled joking at pain as virtuous work, which is something that had not really been seen in the Black press to that point as much. There was obviously a very strong sort of anti-laughter, anti-humor bias in missionary education. And so the Jeremiah Joshua column and R.R. Dlomo's humor writing, I would argue, really did a lot in terms of expanding the boundaries of what Black journalists could joke about in the press. At the same time, Dlomo was obviously operating under incredibly constrained circumstances himself. The South African government was tightening segregation laws, eventually while he was still writing the column, that would become full-blown apartheid, right? The Bantu World was a white-owned newspaper, even though Dlomo was the assistant editor and then the editor. So the boundaries of taboo were very, very much present. You know, there was not an unlimited range of things that people could make fun of in that newspaper. It's a really telling statistic that almost every person I focus on in my book, black or white, died from alcohol-related complications. Almost every single person. Dlomo died of that. Black died from that. Bosman died from that. It's really quite extraordinary. And it's also true, and worth pointing out, that Black and Dlomo both saw humor as an exclusively masculine endeavor. So Dlomo actually, while he was writing these columns, and this column actually is one where they're kind of bantering about women, he was also the women's editor of Bantu World, and he had a separate persona as the editress, where he was pretending to be a woman. And so sometimes on literally adjoining pages, he would be sort of, again, like riffing on romantic life in the one column, and then in the very next page, admonishing women not to smile too much, not to laugh too much, not to joke too much. Nevertheless, Dlomo's column helped to break conservative taboos within Black literary production, especially regarding modern romance and alcohol. And from Dlomo's Joshua and Jeremiah columns, we can trace a line, and you can change the slide here, through to the famous drum writers of the 1950s and 60s. So I got Casey Motsisi up there. Devil May Care satirists like Motsisi, Kantemba, Todd Machikiza. And maybe we could take it even further to popular post-apartheid comedies like the TV show Emzini Wezinsizwa and the web series Noko Mashaba. Another little story, and I don't know if I want to go there. I think I should probably, I was going to talk about family meeting memes, because I've also done a lot of work on that. And I've also been, I was really struck especially by the way that when people during the pandemic in this country talked about Cyril Ramaphosa as Uncle Cyril and national speeches on COVID-19 as family meetings. I wrote a paper which sort of puts that in the context of like histories of family metaphor in South African politics, from sort of Paul Kruger to Tata Madiba, right? Like Father Madiba. But also used it to create this really kind of sophisticated critique of the family meeting itself. Like instead of being this kind of like patriarchal metaphor of kind of the omnipotent ruler or the omnipotent ruling party, people were using actual family meetings that people had lived experience of to actually critique the ways that these structures were actually super, super unequal and unaccountable. But yeah, you can talk to me about that a little bit later. I'll close because I want to have a lot of time for discussion. And change the slide. Probably change a few here. There you go. There he is. Change the slide again. 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 See, these are good. These are good. Change it again. Actually, I think that's the last one. I wanted to wrap up just by saying a little bit about where I think we can go with humor studies and take the momentum of this work moving forward. I think we need to recognize that we're at a really different place with this than we were 10 or 20 years ago. There's clearly a lot of momentum, again, in terms of really looking at humor very squarely. And the theme of this conference is really spot on, because there was a time when a lot of that kind of humor studies literature is taking humor that you were attracted to or you felt was really effective or really exciting and kind of, writing a very sort of laudatory study, interpreting that humor, right? But I think the call for papers for this conference really challenges us actually to seek out humor that we don't like as interpreters, or humor that we don't understand, because in some ways that may prove even more revealing. And I think hopefully with sort of the patriarchal and anti-Semitic character of a lot of the humor I've discussed here, we really need to have sort of nuanced conversations about the work that all of this is doing in society. I think, as I did with sort of the Leon Schuster clip a little bit earlier, we definitely need to grapple with this concept of audience. So I've been thinking a lot about social media and the way that we do research with social media. We have to be very curious about social media. And I'm struck with the fact that we were promised this world of no gatekeepers, right? We were promised this world where when social media comes up, we have access to sort of like the unmediated opinions of people, and content creators and content consumers can kind of find each other without mediation. But I think what's happened is with algorithms and stuff, in some ways, the gatekeeping is even more intense, but it's also become more mysterious, more depersonalized, right? People on TikTok talk about, there's a phrase, "I built this for you" page brick by brick, which is kind of an acknowledgement of the fact that, like, I don't understand why I'm seeing this content, but sort of the mysterious algorithm has given it to me. And likewise, if you're a content creator, trying to navigate the currents of virality, knowing that sometimes you'll put something out that is, to you, extremely high quality and it will get nowhere, and then some random video will all of a sudden hit and blow up, right? We really need to be curious about that and think about that when we think about audience. And finally, I've been thinking more and more about using venues like this, or initiatives, all this energy that we scholars seem to have about humor and satire, to actually bring practitioners in, particularly stand-up comedians. Stand-up comedy does not enjoy, I think, nearly the amount of institutional support that I think it maybe merits, particularly in the South African case, where really, South Africa, the stand-up scene is young, but it's incredibly dynamic in terms of the way that it's sort of shaped the post-apartheid pop culture landscape. I think that one of the biggest things that maybe prevents more sort of collaboration between stand-up comedians and people in the academic world is the association of stand-up comedy with nightlife and maybe with alcohol, right? So that presents a number of different challenges. There are a lot of people, obviously, who feel uncomfortable or unsafe traveling to and spending time in venues where alcohol is being consumed. And that affects the pool of people, right, who end up sustaining themselves within stand-up comedy and putting their stories out to the public, right? Particularly, women and LGBTQ people. So I think there are ways that we can think creatively about ways to collaborate on this. If you go to the National Arts Festival, oftentimes you'll find a comedy show that's scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning or 11 o'clock in the morning. I assume not everyone there is drunk. And it seems to come off pretty well if you talk to comedians about it. So I think there's ways that we can sort of think outside the box here. But yeah, I'm going to be here the whole conference. If you have any ideas about that, definitely come and talk to me. Finally, there's a famous song from a show called Spitting Image from the apartheid era called "I've Never Met a Nice South African," which has the line, "He's never met a nice South African, and that's not bloody surprising, man, because we're a bunch of ignorant loudmouths with no sense of humor." And I think since 1994, humor has loomed actually larger and larger as an element of South Africans' intangible identity. I think we're only starting to grapple with the complex significance of this trend. And I think, humbly and maybe self-interestedly, we shouldn't neglect applying a historical perspective as we do this ourselves. So, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Doc, for the illuminating presentation and the highlights that you have given to the uses of humor. We will have 10 minutes of question and answer. Comments as well. When you were speaking about the religious intersections with humor, I recalled the story of Sarah in the Judaist part of the Christian Bible, the Torah, the Old Testament. Sarah earned the name Sarah for laughing at God. The only time in the Bible where God came as man as in is when he came as a guy called Melchizedek, riding a horse, and said, Abraham, my friend, how are you? After eating, God said, you will have children. And Abraham was way mature and Sarah was way mature. So Sarah laughed. And then God said, you will forever be called the laughing one. So that idea of laughing at God and laughing at a supposed blessing and all that. So Sarah, it means the laughing one who laughed at God. Can I have a show of hands for comments? There's Hamish there, Melissa, then Chris. Can you just start with Melissa there?
Robin, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Much appreciated. I don't have a question. I want to make a comment, perhaps two. The first is just to say that we've got Chester missing on Thursday night. So we've got probably our most famous comedian to be part of our conference, and it's quite a scoop. We're very, very, very excited about that. But just to say that the whole point of integrating comedy, real sort of like comedians into our conference was part of what we actually wanted to do, you know. And then I also, just another comment also, you know, from the conference point of view, is that, you know, we really came up against the fact that comedy is very masculine centered. When we were in the earlier stages of putting the conference together, we were really struggling to find, you know, women who would be able to speak at this conference. You know, it was very interesting to us that actually as a field, and even the academic side of the field is very male dominated and very masculinist. So it was very interesting for me to see this historical analysis, and you really can see how that has, you know, the deep roots that has, and how much work we have done to start dismantling that, but just how much more needs to be done.
Thank you, Melissa, for that. Hamish?
Thank you. Dumelang, everybody. And thank you so much for that presentation. Really, really appreciated and enjoyed that journey down history that I didn't have access to before. So deeply appreciative of that. And I think for me, as I was watching the presentation, one of the points that I wrote down before the Jeremiah and Joshua case point came up was I wrote down semiotics and power. And I think it's been sitting with me like across the day, because I think Karen raised the point around like language dominance and language bias. And I think for me, why I wrote that down, and I wrote that and the power of defining is because of how humor at the moment, and it's still very early stage of the conference and this journey, but how humor, as I'm hearing it and being engaged with it, is coming from a sort of largely English language code based defining and understanding. And hence it takes me to semiotics, because a lot of what's been referenced is humor, satire, trickster, comedy within that sort of language code structuring, which is very stereotypical based, and hence semiotics becomes quite important. And the power of semiotics is what gives point and weight and edge to the joke, as it were. Whereas I think in some of the African language codes, humor, as it may be referred to but not defined, is idiomatic. And we saw references to that with the trickster and how often animals are used to sort of exemplify or demonstrate or use the idea of trickster to then communicate that. So it becomes idiomatic and sometimes deeply metaphorical rather than stereotypical. And so for me, like, I'm sitting, again, not as a critique at all. I'm sitting with a beautiful dance of ideas and reflections rather than sharp critique now, because we are at the start. Around that, around saying, so how do we find that sort of perhaps different language code reference and then releasing therefore of power in humor? Because I think some of the points that you were making, particularly around alcohol and consumption and whatnot, took me to space and humor. And when I think of where, from my mixed heritage background, I've experienced the distinction between how humor is manifest in those respective cultures. Things like alcohol play a role not because of drunkenness, but because of performativity, and it's very layered. To say that like there isn't time to go into the nuance of it. But I think for me, like particularly with what your mapping does, and at the moment where you rightfully pointed out the transition of Jeremiah and Joshua, by virtue of the context of publication and then the actual authors in that publication, for me really begins to like illuminate this in a very, very material way. So those are just some initial thoughts that I'm sharing, but deeply, deeply appreciative of this history that I haven't seen before. So thank you for sharing it.
Thanks, Hamish. There's Prof. Chris.
Hello. There we go. Hi. Thanks, Robin. That was a great paper, and I really enjoyed your discussion of Stephen Black, and Lomo. I'd like to hear more about that. Maybe I'll see it in the book. I wanted to know, you're recommending a historical approach, and one thing I know about humor is that it doesn't date well. So I was wondering if you've been going through all this historical humor, and have you found that stuff just, you can see why it might have been funny, but it isn't funny to you anymore? And do you have an idea of why it is that humor is so contemporary and dates so quickly? Do you have some kind of explanation of that?
Thank you. Can I see further hands? Doc, when you're talking about laughter again, and you mentioned Rudyard Kipling, besides Joseph Conrad, is one of the guys who circulated the idea that powerful people should not laugh, or that there's something undignified about laughing. There's a poem of his, I think it's the one called Enjoy, where he actually says, to laugh is to risk appearing a fool. To weep is to risk appearing sentimental. To reach out to the other is to risk involvement. He encouraged this idea that leaders should not laugh in public, because laughter is for small people and all that. Any hands? Sarah?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to share a reflection I had as you were talking, when you were taking us to Spain, to the Camino to Santiago. And I was thinking about some of the clips we're seeing online at the moment, which are so raw and painful, of IDF soldiers in Palestine who are making jokes inside of people's homes, wearing the clothing of people who no longer are in their homes. And I was just thinking about humor and history and spaces and rewounding. Yeah, it was just a comment about that. It came through very clearly when you were showing those images of Santiago. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Later, then we can have Doc respond to your engagements. Any hand? Okay. Yeah, if you can.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of these. You know, as far as the semiotics comment goes, I mean, it's very perceptive of you to I think that's very important. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about in the book is the way that humor, there's a writer called Daniel Wickberg who wrote a book called The Senses of Humor, where he talks about the idea of the sense of humor as being a very sort of modern or industrial age, the way of theorizing about a sense of humor as sort of this individual capacity that you cultivate within yourself, as opposed to, you know, hilarity existing within an object that is ridiculous. And he is sort of limited to the Anglo-American context in that, but there's some really interesting examples when we talk about like missionary education in South Africa. There's a textbook, a like life orientation textbook by the Reverend Bernard Hoos, who is the Catholic school principal in Natal in the 1920s, who wrote an entire book. It's for Black high school students, but there's an entire chapter in that book about cultivating a sense of humor. And there are all of these sort of examples that he cites of different ways in which it's a positive thing, particularly for Black children, to cultivate a sense of humor. And he uses anecdotes from Booker T. Washington and different figures who are responding to racial persecution and racism with humor. So there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of like this kind of very sort of Anglo-centric or Eurocentric understanding of what humor is, which is looming very large for a lot of these like Black intellectual figures, right? But it's not to say obviously that like these other understandings of humor are persisting. They're persisting in like spaces of sociality. They're persisting in trains. So a lot of what Dlomo talks about, like where people are essentially getting their stand-up comedy, is people reading the newspaper on the train to the people assembled, right, on their way to work, and people who almost were professionals kind of riffing on it and performing for their different audiences and stuff. So these traditions are out there. They're just obviously much more difficult to recover if they're not, you know, printed in the Bantu Press Limited, et cetera. The comment about rewounding in the case of all these absolutely disgusting images that are coming out, I think, and it also goes back to this point about like we can't, and it also goes maybe back to Chris's point, like there are certain things that are making people laugh, humorous to some people, that are absolutely horrifying to other people, horrifying to us. But I don't think that gives us a free pass from analyzing them as humor, if that makes sense. Like there's something very unsettling, but I think very important for sort of looking at cases like the clips that you mentioned, or even just, again, like jokes from 100 years ago that are really sort of fall flat or just don't really seem to be, I mean, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that from, I mean, regrettably, there is a lot of stuff from 100 years ago that does still play on humor traditions and stereotypes and situations of oppression and inequality that persist. So there are actually a lot of ways in which like Stephen Black and Dlomo's jokes, like they do hit today. But there are also a lot of things that don't. And I think that part of giving humor its full due is trying to figure out, maybe from a theoretical perspective, like what we do with that, because it really challenges some of the, I think somebody was talking in the trickster panel about romanticizing humor. And I don't think that's something that we should be doing, right? Is there any comment that I've really failed to engage? I wasn't writing things down. Okay.